Ladies and gentlemen, today I remind every politician, and I remind every teacher, and I even say to every immigrant, no matter what your circumstance is, no matter where you live, your path will be a path of promise in Sweden. We are transforming our society by raising standards and focusing on results. We are insisting on accountability while making sure that people, of course, are in charge of their own destiny. Because by testing every immigrant, we are identifying those who need help. Now that principle is the principle that expresses the philosophy of our society in the following way. We don't focus on what immigrants can't do, we focus on what immigrants can do. And we do whatever it takes to help them across that line. And that principle is challenging the soft bigotry of low expectations. Now when George W. Bush spoke these words, he was not talking about immigration, but he was talking about schools and education. But the same principle applies. And we already heard Johan spoke referring to the M word. To what degree can we make things mandatory? To what degree can we expect things from people that come to Europe? Is it not in fact something that we owe them? Is it not bigotry? Is it not in their own interest that we have these expectations and tests and results? Because otherwise they just come here and we leave them to their own fate without any real hope of integration. So we owe it to them to make real demands and real tests and make sure that they succeed. Otherwise, we are just having a bigotry of low expectations. Having said that, we move over to our next panel who will deal with these questions. We're very glad to have three specific presentations. The first one will be by Leoni, who will set the framework from a little bit more theoretical perspective on problems of integration. We have Karin Zelano from Forest and Health Member Organization, who will give some very concrete examples. And we have Johan, Hedin, Member of Parliament for Centerpartiet and spokesperson for migration. We will do the three presentations. First, can I have all three speakers on the podium, please? Ladies and gentlemen, the first one up is Leoni.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here in Malmö högskola. While listening to previous speakers yesterday, I was actually very glad to hear that all of you touched upon values, which will be my contribution for today. You touched on it in different ways. Lucy, Serna, you asked the question, can immigration be seen as a stimulus? Tove Livendahl, you asked the question, how are we using the capacity or the resources of immigration? Also Cecilia Wikström touched upon this when she talked about the need of change in attitudes and the need for political will. Also Timo Cancel talked about values as critical for migrants when deciding where to go. So integration deciding immigration. My contribution is actually to highlight the importance of these values even more. When listening to Tobias Billström yesterday, I also picked up on the fact that he said that it's very important to avoid barriers, and I think it's even more important to identify these barriers. What kind of barriers are we talking about? It's not always physical barriers. It's not always described in documents. I claim that at the heart of all of these issues raised, and many more, lies the social construction of the other, in this case, the immigrant. And this social construction is counterproductive in relation to whatever measures or non-measures that would be suggested. My aim with this presentation is, like I said, to raise awareness regarding the fact that immigrants in Sweden are excluded from the labour market and society at large, mainly due to what I call institutionalized low expectations. When speaking of immigration, Sweden has generally been regarded as progressive in the eyes of the world, and perhaps mostly in the eyes of Sweden, in her own eyes. Sweden is known to make consistent efforts to tackle the consequences of immigration in different ways. Perhaps this Swedish model best could be described as a model of good intentions. At least the intentions are perceived as good. However, it has not been very successful. In fact, Swedish immigration is commonly seen as a failure in the debate. With the background of a crisis within Europe and a populist wave, Sweden is not spared from this development, of course. The Swedish Democrats are today establishing in the Swedish Riksdag, and debate regarding immigration is very polarized. It is often debated whether the requirements on immigrants should be raised. This rhetoric, in my view, is in favor of the populists. This requirement rhetoric perceives the immigrant as someone unwilling to integrate, unwilling to be included. Stepping aside from this requirement debate, which is more apparent in Europe, but also reflected in the debate here in Sweden, mostly regarding language tests nowadays. I claim that Swedish perception or Swedish image of the immigrant are socially constructed, and that these stand in the way of successful integration. From my initial observations, I argue that it's critical that these perceptions of the immigrant are researched, especially since we have a new empirical field for Swedish integration, since Swedish integration is in transformation. And this is expressed in the new, or the newly suggested and implemented reform for the introduction of newly arrived immigrants, also better called maybe immigrant reception. This is a reform for the introduction of newly arrived immigrants in society, and it was introduced in 2010. The intention could be possibly best described in the title of the proposition preceding the law, the reform, named Personal Responsibility with Professional Support. So the intention mainly is about moving away from the social care treatment, the Swedish word for it, omhändertagande, which actually cannot be translated in a very good way, which maybe says a lot. And this reform has not really lived up to its expectations. This is partly apparent in statistics, although I'm not a fan of numbers. It's evident that it's not been that successful, since maximum 5% of the coming newly arrived immigrants have received employment since the reform took place. And this reform is primarily an organizational transformation for you, or maybe outside from Sweden. Maybe this expresses the Swedes' love for interaction, as you call in Sweden, samverkan. The success of integration has mainly been reduced to be a simple matter of control and efficiency. And I claim that whatever model one chooses for integration, these counterproductive perceptions of immigrants are critical. The image that is dominant today is a very concrete barrier, I would say. So what is this construction then? The social construction of the immigrant shows low expectations. We have very low expectations on immigrants. The immigrant is perceived as a person lacking resources, incapable person, very poor person. And I claim that we need to research this view. Some illustrations of what I mean with these low expectations and this social construction of the immigrant is shown in my initial observations that the immigrant lacks agency. And since this is very apparent, since agency is only addressed to the actors working with the immigrant rather than the immigrant him or herself. So the organizations surrounding the immigrant, handling, managing the immigrant, are the actual actors. Agency is never given to the immigrant. And this is, of course, very contradicting the fundamental intentions trying to make the immigrant responsible for his and her own integration, addressing back to the proposition, personal responsibility for the integration, personal responsibility with professional support. What happened with that? How are you supposed to be personally responsible when you lack agency, when you lack ownership of your own integration? What's most interesting, I think, is the fact that people are not very aware of this. When I've discussed this with national responsibles surrounding this reform, they seem quite taken because they've never thought of this. They've never thought of the immigrant as an actor. And because they've never thought of the fact that the immigrant is not an actor. It's taken for granted. Another example, I think, is which can illustrate this in a very good sense, is that incentives are always connected to some kind of economic compensation when we talk about immigrants. This is very apparent in the documents leading to the reform. Low expectations, I think, lead to some kind of an assumption that we need to buy immigrants' will to integrate, because they don't really want to. So we need to lure them into integration somehow. They're not interested in this. How are then these constructions implemented? These low expectations are visualized mainly in contact between the frontline bureaucrat and the immigrant. This contact is the very basis of integration, many would say, the very basis of integration policy. It's very essential because immigrants depend on state support during their initial period in Sweden, and in many cases over a longer period of time, maybe too long. Sometimes this is also the only contact that you have with Swedish society. So this contact with the frontline bureaucrat, who could be, well, anyone really, depending on what kind of organization you have. Sometimes this is the only contact you have with Sweden, I would say. Frontline bureaucrats including this new private act that has been introduced, the introduction guide, affected by policy, tend to fall back into the same old patterns, taking care of the poor immigrants. So the frontline bureaucrats are either dealing or constantly struggling with social support. And this has also been proven in the government's own evaluations. So immigrants are rather handled than professionally supported, I would say. Another example is that the employment officers tend to have problems assigning different employment activities to immigrants. And they explain this problem with the fact that activities are not adjusted. This is very interesting when it comes to relating back to the low expectations. We need to adjust everything for these immigrants because they lack something. And this term, adjustment, I think, also is the foundation of integration concepts such as cultural competence, which I think we need to be very careful with and very aware of. Because doesn't cultural competence entail making up for some kind of incompetence of the counterparty? And to conclude, my contribution to this is maybe to raise a question: can we maybe stand for a Swedish model, a new model, the Swedish challenge, maybe it could be called? Raise expectations on immigrants and see them as contributors to the Swedish society. And with that, I would really like to hear your comments and thoughts on these issues. Thank you.
All right. Well, we set up the panel in a way that we decided to have the first 3 presentations, and then we're going to go open up the floor for questions. So keep those questions in mind, and then we'll have a broader discussion. Next speaker, Karin Zelano from Florida. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vali, for an extremely interesting presentation. And first of all, I'd like to thank Gabriel and Sofia for inviting me, and of course, the European Liberal Forum. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Karin Zelano, representing Forest, a green and liberal think tank, also an ELF member. And there I work as coordinator for our migration team. So just as some of you might have seen, I wasn't in the original program for today. And well, as you know, all the international top-notch events like this, they have a secret guest. So, you know, some get Bill Clinton, others Elton John, and you got me. I'm sorry about this. I'll dedicate some minutes trying to illustrate the role of expectations in the context of migration and integration. And I'll do this by a selection of examples provided by 2 reports from Forest on Somali immigration to Sweden. So, although difficult to tell, there is about 50,000 Somalis living in Sweden, making the Somali community one of the largest immigrant groups in the country. Now, in terms of integration results, the result is discouraging. No other immigrant group shows such low levels of employment. No other group so poor results or so poor levels of business activity. In addition to that, there has been recurrent reports on Somalis in Sweden being harassed. So in the last decade, we've seen many Somalis leave Sweden after some time for other countries, some like the UK, for example, as they find it easier to set up a business there and create their own future. And this, of course, isn't just a lack of human capital for Sweden, it's also a loss of potential role models for the Somali community left in Sweden. So we found it interesting to look at why is this happening. And last year, a delegation went to Leicester and Birmingham and interviewed or performed in-depth interviews with 16 Somali Swedes living in the UK after having spent on average 11 years in Sweden. And by the time of the interviews, they all had their own business in the UK. So please, I remind you once again the title of today's session, as we'll look closer on what those entrepreneurs had to say, or with some quotes from the report. And we'll start with one quote from a Somali Swede still in Sweden, trying to explain what he thought was a common perception among the Somali Swedes in the UK when asked to look back on how their lives had been like what their lives had been like in Sweden. And the same person goes on. I don't know. Can everyone read this?
You should read it for the.
So the first quote goes, "Oh God, I lost so many years in Sweden." And the same person goes on saying, "The only contact you have apart from family is authority. The social welfare office, it's just contact with the authorities the entire time." So then the entrepreneurs in the study was asked about what they found being the disadvantages of living in Sweden. And this is what some of the things they answered. "You're always a foreigner. There's no difference between a newcomer and someone who spent 12 years in the country. And last, in Sweden, you can't show what you're made of. There's no one who believes in you." So in the following years, about 20,000 Somalis are expected to apply for permission to be reunited with their families in Sweden, family members already living in Sweden. And more or less with the same method as in this first study, this past June, we sent the same researcher to Nairobi to perform interviews with some of the people waiting for permission to reunite with their family members waiting in Sweden. And the specific aim of the interviews, still not published, so I encourage you to look, keep your eyes open and join us when we launch this publication. But I'll give you a pre-launch now. So the specific aim of the interviews was to chart the expectations of individuals waiting to go to Sweden, what expectations they had on their future in their new home country, with the ambition, of course, to facilitate the integration process. So this first quote tells about Habiba, who lives with one child, a three-year-old child in Eastleigh, which is a neighborhood where most Somalis in Nairobi live. The father is in Sweden, and here you can read, "Habiba has never gone to school, but hopes to do so in Sweden and wants to enter the labor market. She says she's prepared to take any job." The next one is from Idris, a 16-year-old boy, who all he knows about Sweden is that it's better than in Africa. So he has no education, but would like to become an engineer or a doctor. Next they met with a family with 6 children, aged 18 to 13, the mother waiting in the county of Gävleborg, and the children haven't seen their mother in 4 years. Starting with the oldest, the children dream of becoming a doctor, pilot, engineer, teacher in English and Swedish, and a footballer like Messi. Lastly, there's a father, Abdi, who lives in Nairobi by himself, no education, and waiting to join his 1-year-old daughter and the mother in Sweden. His highest priority is to give his daughter an education. He wants her to be the most highly educated woman in Sweden. So, here it is. You have the expectations of Somalis waiting to go to Sweden. And well, there you have the result of what must be seen as a failed integration policy. But with one crucial difference, I think, that the people behind those quotes on the right-hand side, they still haven't arrived in Sweden. They're waiting to come. So their expectations are still high, which is kind of I think it's a inspiring image. I mean, without ignoring the huge challenge an increased influx of Somali immigrants will mean to Swedish society. Most of them come traumatized after having spent years separated from their family. Most of them have very basic or no level of education. But still, I'll end my presentation with these quotes from these young Somalis, and I hope this can provide a quite concrete framework for our discussion later. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karin. Very interesting and very, I think, very concrete. It's always good at some point to take it down a notch and make policy issues go on what it should be really about, of course, and it's the young people. At the same time, you wonder, is it naivety, is it idealism, or is there a bridge between the two? It's definitely a shame that we do not have Thomas Billström here with us today. I would have loved to see his reaction or hear his response to these stories as well. But we are very honored that we have somebody here from the Member of Parliament, Johan Hedin, Member of Parliament for Centerpartiet and spokesperson for migration and integration.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yeah, good.
First of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the European Liberal Forum and Leoni Institute for a very great conference. I learned a lot so far and had lots of fun, and that's a good combination. I'm the new guy here. I've been in the Parliament for 5 weeks, so I'm learning as I go now. So, and also, I have to apologize in advance for my bad English. I will try to make it as little bad as possible. However, migration is a complex topic in many ways. Nevertheless, the great importance to enhance respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms by allowing migration is way too important to be neglected. Let us start by remembering that migration is not something new. We heard that yesterday in Cecilia's speech. She mentioned the Bible even. The concept of moving dates as far back in history as one can go. Human beings have always been moving throughout history for all kinds of reasons. Sweden has a proud tradition of an open attitude to the world and is deeply rooted in our culture to welcome new people to our country. Our open attitude has enriched our country in many ways. I believe that if we pursue openness towards others, we will enjoy even more gains in the future. However, unfortunately, current debates on migration in Sweden and Europe are far from what I would want to call liberal. In an increasingly harsh climate on migration, it is therefore necessary to stop for a while and answer a number of questions in order to see this big picture. Why is the ability to migrate important? People have throughout the world always escaped danger, lack of freedom, or moved in order to obtain a better position in life and create a hopeful future. The reasons for migrating are many. When prompted by example fleeing war, persecution or severe environmental damage, they however become alarming. It's a serious restriction of liberty to prevent people from moving wherever they want. And we cannot and we should not escape from the moral obligation we have to offer people protection from bondage and oppression. But we can also gain from migration, and this is what this conference is all about. Due to migration, we can enjoy several positive effects. These gains can be on more personal levels and also supporting community and bringing about society gains, such as increased trade relations with other nations. In a globalized economy, increased international trade due to migration adds to all benefits. For Sweden, which is a small export-dependent country, but in Europe as a whole. I think most of you can agree that I'm not exaggerating, but by stating that when people meet and share experiences, development is created. Thanks to migration, Sweden has in different times managed to meet the needs for certain skills, employment and new business. Even today, all of this is true, especially when our needs for employment merely will increase over time as population ages. And I would like to look at it in the other way around also. Over 100 years ago, about 2 million Swedes went over to North America to pursue their happiness there. Nowadays, Swedes choose to move across borders in order to work, study, simply discover new sides of the world, maybe even themselves. Whether they seek better markets for the great idea, or if they want to enjoy warm evenings as senior citizens. We don't have lots of warm evenings in Sweden, just as happened. This is also an important aspect of migration and a freedom that must remain protected. But our current situation is far from sustainable. Therefore, we need to address the structural and institutional barriers that newcomers face. The debate must move from being merely problem-focused to seriously start talking about how we can upgrade our systems, allowing people to get a job, start their own business, and with all this, and being allowed to become a part of the community, contribute to the common development while realizing their own dreams. And in many cases, we cannot remember that, save their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting contribution, and I heard in the contribution that the words come together, a fundamental right to migrate, which I think is very interesting, which links back to the work that Heidi Avellan yesterday also spoke about the history and the Bible. Of course, in legal terms, I'm still jurist enough to realize that in legal terms that could constitute some problems. But we have somebody very specific in the audience with us who's going to comment on these contributions. And then we're going to open up the floor for contributions, but she will remain a, let's say, guest commentator for this topic. While I go back. There we go. As a professional commentator, I would say for Sydsvenskan, Heidi Avellan, please join the panel. You will get one here. You will have a kind of special position. We already mentioned that we had a guest speaker. Heidi is like our guest judge, almost, so to say. So feel free to really get in there into the discussion. Maybe we should move a little bit to get the light out of your eyes for the camera as well. But what we have for you is first you get the floor to comment in general on the different contributions. And then we open up the floor. However, Heidi will have at any time the right to interrupt and say what she thinks or go against it or strengthen your words. And she has two ways of doing that. One, if she thinks this was an excellent statement, I would like to elaborate, she will light the green lighter. If she thinks, I am sorry, but what you are saying is complete nonsense, I really need to go against it, she will light the red lighter. The moment she lights one of these lighters...
You know, I'll be concentrated on red, green. I'll probably will hear nothing, not listen, just focus on the lighters. I'm sorry.
You know what, if you hold it like this, nobody sees the color.
Well, we're very grateful you didn't hand it out the lighters before the presentation.
So,
Thank
you can interrupt at any time, but before we do that, Heidi, the floor is yours for opening comments on these.
Yeah, a couple of reactions, comments. Wonderful, great, I'm so happy. I would love those dreams you told about from Nairobi to come true. Just welcome them to Sweden, open up, let them become whatever, pilot, football player, soccer player, sorry. But then, on the other hand, what we heard was that they, most of them hadn't, they can't read and write, frankly, right? So if you come to a society like Sweden and you can't read or write and you are, I don't know, were the teenagers? Yeah, teenagers. Your friends are quite a bit ahead of you, right?
Definitely, and I was deliberately pushing it when actually just picking out the best pieces or the very optimistic parts. But of course, I mean, the subject of today is the role of expectations, and this, I mean, it was really pushing it, but the aim was to show like the other side of the coin. I mean, I think all of us are very well acquainted with the first side, that low expectations, but we seldom get the other side of the story, that there are actually high expectations as well, with the potential of creating a good circle. But of course, I mean, there are enormous challenges ahead.
And the question is, how can you even make those dreams come true? I would love that to happen.
Exactly. When you read the quotes, I mean, it's bittersweet, because of course what shines through is like any other teenager. These teenagers in Nairobi have their dreams and ambitions, and yet we all know that this isn't realistic. But I think it's
a small comment on meeting authorities. It's really up to us, isn't it? If any one of you invite an immigrant to your home, come and have dinner with me and my family. You came from Somalia last week.
I have to admit I haven't.
Me neither. And I live in Malmö. I guess there would be like a couple of 100,000 immigrants to invite. It's not difficult to find them, and the idea hasn't even crossed my mind. So, who do you meet? You meet authorities, right? And how do authorities treat you? Well, they treat you as authorities too. So you aren't really regarded as a friend, a human being, a neighbor. You are just something to take care of.
You stay an immigrant, like they say.
You stay
as well.
an immigrant.
You're always a foreigner.
Never part of the society, and that's really, really sad. But to go to Leoni's, the first introduction here, about the Swedish model. I mean, it was sad to listen to you, because, yeah, we all know that picture, right? This is how things are. But you didn't really mention why, because there is something about the Swedish model that it was meant to be good, and in this specific case, it doesn't really work. It's about equality. It's about being able to earn as much money or have as much money as your neighbor or any other guy, which means that if you come here, you have nothing. You get into being a part of the immigrant system because there are good intentions. The Swedish society really wants you to have a good life and get into the society, and as we see, the result is quite different, right? Do you have any idea on how we could do that differently?
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to raise, because I think in many times maybe taking less action would be better than acting too forcefully. For instance, when you talked about the possibility for teenagers coming here and the possibility, the real possibility for them to become doctors, I think it's not really about discussing whether this is a relevant dream or not. I think we should maybe address this as an issue of being able to have dreams. So a Somali teenager is supposed to have, should be able to have the same kind of dreams as the Swedish teenager. And I think that just raising the awareness of these social constructions that we have dominantly in our minds, but many times are not aware of them, I think makes the biggest difference.
Maybe, or and it's just reality. Why you keep on dreaming? Why you try to learn to read and write and maybe even try to learn Swedish? Because you're determined, you will live in Sweden, you will probably be Swedish. Why you do that? You have to, you or your parents have to get money from the system, or because the Swedish model doesn't really allow you not to have money, right? We want a society with as little inequality as possible. We want people, we don't want that social pressure, that tension that would be the result of immigrants with no support from the system. And that's not because we love the immigrants, it's because we love society. I think it's kind of supporting the Swedish model for other reasons than the immigrants, the best of the immigrants. And that I really think is the big problem here, that the Swedish society wasn't really meant for immigration. It wasn't built that way. We built a Swedish society for Swedes moving in from the countryside maybe to the bigger cities, but that's the immigration it allows. Somebody coming from the outside is an outsider, and that's really, really a problem. Not only the social construction, but the whole construction of the whole society.
But isn't it also equality to be able to have the same
I absolutely
chances?
agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the tension within the society really is an issue, right?
Yeah, I agree.
I would like to just comment on that. I mean, maybe, well, to some extent, I think you're right. But when talking,
I just being realistic
like,
and trying to provoke.
But when talking about integration, I think you're right that what's missing. I mean, the Swedish society, I think we find it quite comfortable that we have a system, that the state has a big role in the integration process, and we're kind of hesitant to actually take that active part that you're looking for
as persons
as
and
persons.
individuals.
Exactly, and I mean, when discussing integration, I think liberals tend to focus a lot on creating institution that gives immigrant the incentive to look for a job and to work hard. But I mean, as true liberals, we should also look at our own personal responsibility.
Wonderful. She got my point.
Lighter, please.
Heidi, thanks for your first comments. Johan, can I ask you to expand a little bit on, yesterday we heard Tobias Billström, which was very much a story propagating the Swedish model almost as an example of how it should be done throughout the European Union. Today we hear quite critical voices, people saying, well, actually one of them actually said it's a failed system, it didn't work. This is the result we see. Where do you stand in those?
I will give both of them right in certain perspectives. The new labor immigration is fairly new to Sweden. We have it for soon 4 years, and then we can evaluate it good. And I think it's a good system. I think it's very bad that we closed that door in the 60s in Sweden. We had very successful immigration in Sweden in the 50s and the 60s. People were coming on a Friday and they start working on a Monday from south of Europe mostly. And it was a very good system. But unfortunately, that closed down in '69, I think. And after that, it was very hard to come to Sweden just to get a job. And it was only refugees that came along. And the problems, of course, I don't want to play the blame game with this, but there are created problems, structural, institutional, and cultural problems that raises the barriers for newcomers to come into our society. That is very bad, and we have to address those problems with great force.
What are the biggest problems?
Well, I would say 3 things mostly. The labor market, of course. In Sweden, in the 20th century, when we built up a very good education system, we raised the bar for entry levels in productivity in the labor market, and also, of course, in salary. And if it comes people from other countries which has not have that good education, they're on a lower productivity level. And to get a job on the labor market, they have to have lower salaries for the companies to be able to employ them. And there are barriers set by, don't have the minimum wages from the government, but we have the institutional labor markets, the labor unions and so forth. They don't allow lower salary and then a quite high level in Sweden. And also we have the regulations on the labor market that that you cannot fire a person. I don't know what it's called in English, but if you're leased in a company, you have to be the first one to leave. And that is a system that protects those who have their jobs for a long time, Swedes. And young people and newcomers, they are in the short end of this road. And also, when the economy goes down, the first one to get out in an unemployment again is young people and newcomers. So there's a risk they don't get the grip on the labor market.
More flexibility in the labor market. One more statement from my side, and then we'll open up the discussion. And I would like you all to also contribute, not only on Twitter, but also raise your hands. Please also agree and most of all disagree with me and with the panel. My statement would be that coming from a country that has a density in population 20 times higher than Sweden, we have a lot of problems with integration. I feel that Sweden can still prevent a lot of the problems that we've had in the Netherlands. However, in order to prevent them, I think this topic is crucial. That we cannot maintain a system of purely voluntary integration. There must be standards, there must be tests, there must be some way of, let's put it a bit sharp, there must be some way of forcing people to integrate. That's my statement. It worked. All the way on the left. We have a microphone there.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. My name is Bernard, I'm from Austria, and we have quite similar problems what Johan was talking about with the Gastarbeiter. Gastarbeiter, freely translated, means invited temporary visiting workforce, if you want to do that. And this Gastarbeiter, they came to Austria, invited by Austria in the 50s, 60s. Mostly unskilled, to do a lot of jobs which Austrians didn't want to do, obviously. And as Johannes Vogel always added that language courses and the improvement of the German abilities of this working force only started like a couple of years back when the politicians realized that they're not going back to their own country. They want to stay in Austria. They live there. A couple of years, they are now second, third generation. This is their home country now, but there's still a lot of cultural differences. What is the result of that? That they had practically, of course, the language barriers, no access to integration. Somehow, you can correct me if this is a little bit far off. They created something like communities, established communities now, even subcultures if you want. And I think now if new people from the same countries come to Austria and then still are confused with the values we have in Austria, like secularity or individualism, which is not as established in the countries where they come from, they are automatically drawn more to these subcultures or established communities, which represents more likely the way they used to live, and they feel more welcome there. So my question would be, how can we somehow make this gap between people who come and integrate them in a society which maybe is a mix of both the subculture and culture currently in Austria? Thank you.
How do we prevent parallel societies to arise within our society?
I think a very good start would be to talk about integration as a bilateral process, not only being someone that should integrate into something. I'd like to share a very brief example of what integration shouldn't be, mustn't be. I was talking to a representative for a big company in Sweden that had joined a program with the ambition to employ newly arrived immigrants, or more or less newly arrived immigrants, educated, mostly accountants, and they were spread all around Sweden to local offices. And I asked her, so, okay, and now 1 year later, what are the reactions? And she said, well, yes, yeah, there's been, it's been a journey, and but so far so good, but there have been quite some problems with the local staff. I was like, okay, tell me more about this. And she said, well, it's kind of hard when you've been working somewhere at your office for 25 years and then comes a new, really hungry, ambitious guy being in the office by his computer at 7:30 in the morning, doing 2 e-learning seminars before your office opens, and it created some tensions. You can understand this, that Ulla, she might get a bit stressed by this. So, but this is when I get to my point. Then this the responsible person, or my counterpart, told me that. So we actually had to have meetings, with the participants to tell them to, you don't do this in Sweden. You have to slow down. And this is not integration to me. Like, this is totally missing the potential in a human being instead of meeting the challenge.
As an individual level, I can understand that. The floor is yours.
Wonderful, it was.
I forgot the colors. Should I leave or?
This was red. This was not really an objection to what you were talking about. This was hilarious, of course. I absolutely recognize the situation with Ulla, but I think we are making everybody an immigrant here. There are immigrants and immigrants. You were talking about gastarbeiters, and this was obviously not a guy who came from Nairobi last week. And making everybody just an immigrant and saying they have problems integrating into our society, it really is I think it's disrespectful towards these people, because you need quite a different, you need the same attitude, of course. You are being welcomed as an individual, but after that you have absolutely different needs. This guy, frankly, he could maybe slow down a bit, just for his own comfortability. But somebody who doesn't even know how to read and write, how can we just melt everybody together and say that this is one group and we discuss them as a group? I thought we were liberals and talking about individuals.
We have to differentiate between groups. On the one hand, I hear integration is a two-way street, but on the other hand, I hear somebody saying, well, we shouldn't maybe even be so culturally sensitive and cultural competent, because that means we're almost insulting them for not being cultural competent. Much harder line. Gentleman in the back. It's very good for your workout in there, one microphone.
Hello, Tori Robertson, entrepreneur from Malmö. Heidi asked if someone has had immigrants at home. I stopped counting at 100. They could be coming from Azerbaijan and Brazil, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, anywhere. Which to me, of hundreds of hours of discussion would be hard to do. And I'll try to make it very short and ask the question.
Thank you.
They say generally that you Europeans in general and you Swedes in particular are living in generation in the best business idea ever performed. A group of social entrepreneurs decided that they would take care of you, and you didn't object. So if you give us, says the social entrepreneurs, a big chunk of your money, we will take care of your lives. And how could you expect that such a society that it doesn't even trust its own citizens will trust the immigrants?
More trust in companies and citizens in their own society, a reoccurring theme from yesterday. Maybe we can take another question on the floor before we get from there. There's a little left to go here first. Yeah. Second row. Yes.
Actually, I have a question for it was like you had this anecdotal evidence, like with the quotes on the screen, but then most of the part we've been talking here about labor migration, and I don't think a Nairobi teenager who can't read and write is going to take part in a program of labor migration. So I was asking myself, you said, yeah, well the policies here have failed for the integration part, but if you would just explain them, how does that compare to labor migration? Because I'm interested in that, the people that come here through that program, is it the same, do they have the same trouble integrating the high-skilled labor immigrants that come here, or is that totally a different thing? Because I didn't really see that in your presentation.
It's a very interesting question, and the truth is, I don't know, but that report should be written, definitely. I just, if I should speculate, I would think that, you know, if you come as a IT technical engineer from Mumbai, you might have somewhat easier to get an invitation, dinner invitation to a Swedish colleague.
Which reinforces Heidi's point of we shouldn't see everybody in the same way in a one-size-fits-all approach.
Well,
here on the left side, and then we go to you.
Hello, Patrick from the Netherlands. This debate focuses on expectations from society, but there are also expectations on the other side, on the immigrant. And nobody talks about that. And well, there's some talk about it, but when I was in Africa and I told them, and they said, we want to come to Europe because it looks wonderful. And I said, I was at school for at least 20 years, they don't believe it. So they don't know what to expect. So I think that's really something you should consider if you take immigrants in, that you have some kind of management for expectations as well.
Realistic expectation management to prevent
well, yeah.
the dissolution.
No, but at least, I mean, being aware of the big gap between the expectations of the people coming here and you know what they face. But I should just to not dedicating 1 hour to Sweden bashing. That most of the individuals in the first studies, they also say when they were asked about the advantages of living in Sweden, they all mentioned wonderful nature. Well, the welfare system. It's a nice country to grow old in. The streets are safe. But very few of them mention the people, though.
Here in front.
Right.
So there's the challenge.
Yeah. Andreas Söderfors from Malmö University. The presentations evoked my association to that possibly we need to create more nodes in society than just state enacted or officially enacted. Because obviously there is this potential failure that Heidi outlined, and on the other hand of the extreme would be our personal action, like Heidi suggests that every individual has an obligation, so to speak, to be an open person. Like, Kant would have said, for instance. But is there anything else we can do? Because what you are telling us is that there is a need for other actors in the so-called integration of creating opportunities. And certainly in Birmingham and Leicester, there must be something in the society that makes people turn into entrepreneurs rather than not doing that. So I wonder if a concept that not has been mentioned very much during this conference yet of civil society will help us out here. If civil society actorship would create another alternative forward. So do you think that that it's possible to create other or alternative nodes that can facilitate the process in bringing the expectations to a better match? That is my question.
Anyone in the panel?
I definitely think so. I mean, I think it's a bit naive to just, think that if we all become aware of our own personal responsibility, the integration will kind of sort itself out. I still think there is a good idea to have some kind of framework. But I mean, this is what's interesting with this new reform we heard about. That it opens up for other actors to take a bigger responsibility in the process of getting people into the labor market and so on. But still, this the reform isn't working as planned. But it's a young reform, and I still see a window for changes or for improvement. And actually, we're planning to. Right now looking at the role of this kind of called Lutzföretag. I don't know what that would be in private introduction guides, maybe private companies
But do you see other
carrying out the
Wait, can I
integration
just ask,
measures.
Leoni, can I ask you to comment, because I still have the feeling that we are talking about possibilities, opening door, widening spaces, and then these people will come in and they have great expectations and they have great education and they will get to work, and we are all very happy here in Sweden. From your contribution, I understand that it's not that easy, and we should really make much higher demands on these people, because the positive side is giving opportunities. But the negative side of that can be leaving people a bit on their own and not really demanding anything, thus not pushing them to their full potential. Can you comment on that?
Well, when it comes to civil society, I definitely think that civil society can make a contribution, especially when it comes to the low-skilled. For instance, for low-skilled women who maybe cannot really show on their merits in the same way as a Swede can, perhaps. Asking, maybe making it possible to ask the question, what resources do you have? What can you contribute to it? And I think that can be a possibility.
Isn't that still the velvet glove, to ask what resources do you have? Shouldn't we say, we're going to test you, we're going to see what resources you have, and then we put you to work?
Well, that's what I would like to actually make us aware of, is that it doesn't bring out the same thing in people to make demands, rather than show that we have expectations. I think we should make a distinction between requirements and expectations.
I think with this about demands, today we have very, very high demands. Obviously, it's very hard to get into the Swedish society. So in real life, it's high demands, but maybe we have to make the right demands. And also, of course, about expectations. And I think it's an educational problem as well. When you arrive to Sweden, of course, it's hard work getting into society if you come from another place and not just the culture. And it will take a great effort. And I think both the immigrant has to put in this effort, but also society and everybody around, as well as the state and the municipal, but also, of course, as people.
So what can we expect from the immigrant?
I think it's interesting also that when we talk about demands and requirements, we always talk about the immigrants. So why not have the same kind of rhetoric for all citizens? I mean, there's no need for these immigrant demands. Rather, it's about obligations as citizens.
Is there anybody in the audience who would like to comment on that? There is no need to put specific demands on immigrants.
Actually, during the last break, we had a discussion with a few participants about demands on immigrants, and well, we found out that maybe language would be one of them, but except from that, you can take the viewpoint that if an immigrant comes to another country and settles there to get himself a better life and stuff like that. Normally, if you think about it, they normally have the motivation to do those things that will integrate them in society. So I think it's quite strange to ask them when they are seeking a way to a better life, and when they have the motivation to do that. Why should you, from a government, from a state perspective, add demands to that? Normally they will learn themselves what is best for them to integrate, and of course the first thing they will notice probably is that learning the language would be good, and trying to interact with the native citizens would be good to integrate. So I find this really strange that a state or an organization would have to, complementary to that, have to make mandatory decisions, like you have to integrate, you have to do this, you have to learn that language, you have to score that much on that test. I don't really understand how you can come to that conclusion.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to raise here, is that it's because of these social constructions that we have of the immigrant that we need these demands, because we're kind of taking the human capital away from the individual. So if we give that back, I don't think that we will need to have this kind of requirement and demand rhetoric that we have, that we need to have, that we obviously need to have today. So in a more productive social construction of the immigrant, this would not be needed.
We put more trust in the immigrant, more trust in the citizen, and yeah, they will use the capacities that they have because they really want to integrate. Johan, is that the current?
Yeah, so we think about this. The only important thing really is that you can support yourself, you get a job, and you obey the law, and nothing else should really be that important.
I also think for all citizens.
Support yourself, you obey the law, and then you get a job.
Yeah,
and if those 3 points are achieved, then we have achieved integration.
I think you have to be careful when you're talking about demands. I mean, demands for what? Should we have tests before by the borders before letting people live? No, I know. And I mean, I think first take the example of language tests. It's been discussed in Sweden if this would be a possible way to raise the status of citizenship. That's a totally different question. There, I'm open for discussion. But I think we should be very careful with this rhetoric stating that, strengthening the image of the foreign-born or the immigrant as someone that has to be I mean, has to have demands on them to actually perform. So I think now we use the term demand on, but I mean, what do we mean by that? Is it to receive social benefit? Is it, I mean, yeah.
Possibly.
So it's important.
Gentlemen,
No.
sorry, you were first. The lady here in this row.
Yes, hello. Elvire from France. I'm living here in Sweden and studying in Malmö University. So we were talking about low expectations on immigrants, and in my opinion, this is the problem mostly. I met many immigrants in Sweden last year. I was working here, and I met a girl from Burundi. She came here, she was 18 maybe, she had to learn Swedish, and she was really ambitious girl, and she had to push the teachers to go to the university because they didn't want her to, they didn't think she could make it. Now she's studying politics. And do you think that we have to change our state of mind about immigrants? Like, do we have to, as you said, like, do we have maybe low expectations and prejudices about them? Like, they cannot make it. Maybe they should just be cleaners, or you know what I mean? And maybe we should talk more about immigrants to succeed, because I think there are a lot of them. I met a lot of immigrants who made it and who are completely integrated. Yeah.
Thank you. And the second one in the back immediately as well.
Thank you. There seems to be a liberal dilemma here, harder for us than perhaps for many others, because I would especially like to hear Leoni's comment on this. It was a great presentation you had, and I think it says a lot about the discourse and as you say, the social construction on immigrants. But so the question would be, how do you change that without? I mean, what instruments do you actually have available in society to change that? Because we can say that, you know, we shouldn't talk about immigrants in that way. Well, you know, we're not deciding that because we're not doing all the talking. So, I mean, are there any in your mind just policies or institutions or you know something, or are we just wandering around on a big talking tour and hoping that everybody else will use different words and different language, different rhetoric regarding this? Thank you.
Very good question. How do we raise expectations? How do we change social construction? And it would be foolish of me to try to answer that. That is exactly what I would like us to. That is what I'm trying to raise here. That we need to look into this on a deeper scale. And I think, for instance, to start with, maybe in integration policy, we need to give the immigrant agency. That is not so hardly done, actually. You only need to be aware of this when you're forming policy, that this person is actually an actor. It's not about, you know, actors surrounding this immigrant. You could start with that, for instance, because it's very obvious that the integration policy with this immigrant lacking agency is mirrored down at the front line, because, well, simply the immigrant lacks this ownership of dealing with integration.
And we have a lighter.
I know you come from the university and you're doing your job very well. But I'd be curious to know, what does this mean in everyday life? And one question about all, who is we? Who is the subject here?
Very good question. I shouldn't say we, actually, but it's hard to talk, you know, without saying we, and to try to give an image of society with these expectations. because I'm very much against this dichotomy of us and them. However, your question was how?
Yeah, well, how does this work in everyday life? But if we talk about this we, it could be all of us living in Sweden, and they would then be them coming here, or we could be the politicians or the policy.
When I say we, I very much
authorities.
mean everyone, and very much including the immigrants, because this social construction is not only constructed from the frontline perspective or the policy perspective and then implemented upon the immigrant. It's actually the immigrant in him and herself are also active in this construction. And since when you as an immigrant come and meet a frontline bureaucrat, for example, you're not in a powerful position. So this construction that...
Nobody is in a powerful position when you meet frontline.
No, maybe not.
But I mean...
However, I think that the construction, that the social construction, the image of the immigrant is also reinforced and reproduced with for the immigrant in the image of the immigrant.
Let me take this on a bit dangerous path then again in a room of liberals and ask Johan. We need to change the social construction. We need to change the way people perceive immigrants, talk about immigrants. Does the government have a role in changing our society?
Well, government has a role in some parts of the problems, because some parts of the problems are created by politicians and policies. And of course, if we create those problems, we can remove them. I don't say it's easy, because...
what is example created by politicians?
As I was mentioning earlier, labor market issues, and also educational issues, I would say. And also maybe we have, or not maybe, we do have to reform the welfare system for the future, because in the demographics and everything, it's not going to be sustainable for many years. So either way, if we like it or not, we have to make great reforms to the welfare system in Sweden.
I had a comment to the French lady. I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's a very bad combination of low expectations and high horses, maybe. So we're very good at, as Håkan also mentioned, we're very good at talking about, that we have to embrace the multicultural society, and we have to, become more, raise our expectation. But I mean, there's a big difference between a society that contains or that harbors many cultures and a true multicultural society. And I mean, one excellent first step would be that official Sweden would be more representative, for example. Yeah, I definitely think that we should get off our high horses, and then maybe the expectations will follow. I mean, just to get back to the forest study, my study. Don't mention that to Benny Carlson, who's the author. I mean, none of those Somali Swedes flourishing as entrepreneurs in Leicester and Birmingham, none of them mentioned. Well, they of course mentioned the market regulation as being a big problem, but they all had in common was the expectations that they met. Like, they were just sent to more and more training, education. They were, when they said that I would like to start a company, I had a company in Somalia, they were met with, that's great, but I still think you should, maybe take another course. And after 11 years, you get fed up and you leave. So.
All right, Johan.
But in a legislative point of view, changing attitude is not very easy. I cannot suggest a law to force people to have better attitude.
Oh,
You can. You can try.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, here in the front.
Yeah, thank you. Short question. You were talking a lot about the image that other people have of immigrants, and it seems in the whole perspective, in your whole discussion, 90% to 100% of all your images on immigrants comes from the asylum system. You're speaking about asylum seekers. You're not speaking of immigrants in general. and you're generalizing immigrants to asylum seekers in this discussion. So I see this whole image that you think others have of immigrants. You are a very big part of that.
Well,
Yeah, please.
well, the discussion was what role does low expectations, play? And well, we could discuss international students or labor migrants, but I don't see that low expectations is that big of a hinder for those groups to enter society. But of course, you're right.
Yes, and that is a big problem in the debate in Sweden. I don't know for the rest of Europe, but it's too much problem-oriented, I think. We have to focus on the possibilities. Because what we heard from Johannes Vogel earlier today, there is no choice between we should have migration or not. We have to have migration. Otherwise, by 2050, the year 2050, the economy in Europe will collapse. This is no choice. We have to have immigration from outside Europe.
I think it's a very valid point, and also for highly skilled laborers, I think it can be very culturally difficult to integrate into the workforce here. If I take myself as an example, as a highly educated immigrant into Sweden, it's very difficult to come into the closed systems of society here often, in my experience. And I think that's experience that a lot of highly skilled workers have here. Again, that reaches back to the question of culture and how do you change the attitude in society. And you also mentioned the issue of the perception that Swedes have of themselves and of changing the picture, the outward picture of Sweden. Sweden should be more representative. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Oh, you're talking to me.
I talked about it, but any one of you is free to elaborate.
No, I mean, we often underestimate the importance of social networks. I think there's estimates talking about 70% of all jobs being actually found, positions being filled through connections. We're so used to looking at Swedish society as just purely being purely consist of institutions that we forget that we're actually very interconnected. All of us born here. So I really think that this is something that, with a higher awareness of the social networks and the role they play, we can also create better conditions for a successful integration of all immigrants, high-skilled, low-skilled students.
But really, social networks, is that really a Swedish problem? I thought social networks were all over the place, all over the world. That's what we people do. We connect and we create social networks.
Well,
I understand that you have a problem with social networks. It's hard to get into them. I had the same problem when I got here 20 years ago, really more than 20 years ago, as highly educated, but not born in Sweden. And still, I think it's really, well, it's as you see, it's making me a bit angry that we even start to compare this with somebody coming, a Somali coming from Nairobi today who can't even read and write, and we complain about the problems of getting into social networks. High command. It's, I think these problems are like from different planets, and the big integration problem in Sweden today is not the highly educated not feeling comfortable with social networks.
Johan.
Social networks can be everything. It can be exclusive clubs for intellectual people speaking amongst themselves. There could also be a football club. And I think those things are very important in the civil society. I got to know my first immigrant by playing soccer with them. So I think that's a very important thing to have small bridges in society and meeting places for every kind of people.
Yes, I think you misunderstood. My point was that not everything can be done through state programs, that we also have to take into consideration.
There I absolutely agree, but I still think that we mix we squeeze all immigrants into the same can now and try to solve their problems. When we have immigrants coming from all over the world, with different education, some with absolutely no education, facing absolutely different problems in our society, then I think it is talking about our problems with social networks is a bit kind of not a problem at all. It's a non-issue in this context. If we're talking about getting into the Swedish society and support,
But the
you
Swedish
said
society consists of the networks and the connections between individuals.
But
wouldn't you say?
this is absolutely. But is this the biggest problem, or is it a bigger problem that people come here and can't support themselves, never get the chance to be part of anything here? We come here and we have a job, we have a university, we have something where we belong, but and we have, I think the expectations aren't that low. Those facing those expectations don't have any networks either, but they don't have an education, they don't have a real chance to get anywhere. And we just mix all these problems. I think this discussion, it will be really, really difficult if we can't separate these issues.
But seeing the individual who lacks education as equal to lacking resources, I think is what is dangerous. Because even though you don't have a CV in the Swedish manner, it's very important that we work on the system of validation and actually asking people very
but if you have a CV, you have greater opportunities in a society where a CV is your ticket in
We're
the
going to
society.
take one more question in the back, and then...
Yes. Thank you very much, Johan. You mentioned about, you talked about the social construction of immigrants and about specific groups in society. But there's also the social construction of society as a whole. And you are comparing the situation over here with the situation that the immigrants, the Somalian immigrants, that meet in Great Britain. But obviously here we talk about integration, and the whole time integration. It's also the discourse that we have in Belgium. But in the Anglo-Saxon countries, it is a segregated system. They live in separate communities and they're catering for themselves, and they are being catered by their own networks, their own religious institutions, and so on. In France, and again, there's a system of secularization. I would really like to hear then what kind of society as such do you envision? What kind of society would you like to construct that enables certain kind of networks?
Somebody that has a visionary statement on this.
But just a brief comment. I mean, it's true that, for example, taking the Somali diaspora, one of the largest concentrations is in the UK, and I personally don't think it's a problem that you have this very flourishing entrepreneurial focals in Birmingham or Leicester with Somali community living together. I don't know if I misinterpreted you, but I think at your point
I'm not talking about Somalians starting a Somali restaurant or doing something and having an entrepreneurial spirit as such. The question is very often about norms and values, about women's rights, it's about headscarves, it's about religion. It's about people that are actually brought up in a different manner, and then the food they eat can be a symbolic issue, but will indeed not be the key problem. The key problem will be, as we see in France, this debate about the veil, about the headscarf. Can they indeed live in separate regions, segregated, and then force their women to wear a headscarf? Can they indeed impose society to accept those different norms and values? What is the liberal answer to that?
Of course, in theory, the liberal answer is society builds from underneath. So if people just, if you leave them alone, they can get a job, they support themselves, they should be able to move wherever they want, and what kind of clusters or social networks they want. But of course, there is other problems connected to this, maybe with oppression in the society, or maybe. But then you have to address those issues separately.
No, I mean, that's definitely a challenge, but I like to quote myself there and say that, I mean, there's a difference between having a society of many cultures and a society that actually stays objective between different cultures. So I mean, and that's a real challenge, because as long as we have the same culture, we all think the state and the institutions is objective. But as soon as you put in another culture with other values, then you have a conflict. So I mean, someone said, you know, the rule of law is kind of a basic instrument. Yeah, that's a good, I mean, wearing a headscarf doesn't hurt, from a liberal perspective, doesn't hurt the person next to me.
I think we're getting into a very interesting topic that will undoubtedly create great discussions over lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, can I have a very big applause for the